Today I'm going to show you how to work a hat for Rachel, which is a top-down hat, one of our favorite hats here in the store. I'm also using one of our favorite yarns. This is River City Yarns Epic Yarn. It's 100% wool and it's a very nice yarn for doing hats. It's also a little bit thicker than the yarn that we call for in the pattern, but that's okay because this pattern is a fabulous pattern for making hats out of any gauge of yarn. You just have to, I'll teach you that trick in a little bit. I'm also using double pointed needles because this hat starts at the top and that's where DPNs are very handy to have. I'm using my Addi FlipStix and they are a really cool double pointed needle. They have a regular tip at one end and a sharp pointed tip at the other end, and that allows you to flip them depending on which end you want to use. All right, with the pattern, you start with a little bit of I-cord. So the instructions tell you to cast on 4 stitches to begin with. You can cast them on any way you like. I'm using a long tail cast on method, but you can use a knitted cast on or anything else. Then once you've cast on the 4 stitches to do I-cord, you don't turn your work. You take those stitches and you push them down to the other end of your needle. You pick up a second double pointed needle and you knit those stitches, carrying the yarn across the back of your work. So here you go. I usually give this stitch a little bit of a tug after I'm done, just to tighten up that strand that goes across the back of the 4 stitches. 2, 3, and 4. When you've knit those 4 stitches, you again slide them back to the other end of your needle and knit them again. This is a very strange way of knitting for people who've only done it, if you're doing it for the first time. But it's actually just knitting in the round and you are carrying the yarn behind you. It works if you just have a few stitches to go on. If you try to do this behind, say, 8 stitches or 12 stitches, you would have a hard time getting that strand across the back to be the same tension as the rest of your stitches. All right, so that's I-cord. You just carry on making it as long or as short as you'd like it to be. You can make a short, nubby little top to your hat, or you can make a long top to your hat. Over here, I have a little bit of I-cord that I've worked on a bit longer, and this is long enough now that I can tie a knot in it if I wanted to at the top of my hat. Just like that. So I just try it out before I go on to the rest of the hat. Or another kind of cool option is when you're done, you're going to have to weave in this tail anyway, is just to fold the I-cord over like this. Use your end to weave this part into the top of your hat and you have a cool little loop for the top of your hat. So that's how to do I-cord. Next we'll start the base of the hat. The next set of instructions in the pattern tell you to increase for the top of your hat. And so round 1, we're going to increase into the front and back of every stitch. So I'm going to do that here on my I-cord. The increase is to a knit into the front and then into the back of your stitch. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And notice I'm just going to leave those 8 stitches on one needle. I'm going to show you a bit of an alternative to the way the pattern instructs you to do this. The pattern instructs you to do it right away on 4 needles, but we're going to just stick with a fewer number of needles to begin with. Okay, so I've got my 8 stitches, and then in the pattern it says to transfer the stitches so that you have 2 each on 4 double pointed needles. We're going to not do that just yet. We're going to make it a little bit easier for you by sliding those stitches back to the other end, just like with your I-cord. And then you're going to knit this round. So we're just going to knit 4 stitches onto this first needle, or half of your stitches onto this first needle. And this is round 2 of the pattern where you're instructed to just knit. Now I'm going to pick up a third actually, DPN, and I'm going to knit the next 4 stitches onto that double pointed needle. And the reason why I'm doing this is because it's just a little bit easier to work with 2 needles in the beginning rather than 4. Okay, So I'm still knitting in the round. I have my stitches. I got 4 stitches on the first needle that I picked up and 4 stitches on the second needle that I picked up. I turn the whole thing 180 degrees. So now the needle that has the yarn attached to it is on the bottom, and the needle that I'm going to knit to next to join this, keep this joined in around, is on the top. All right, so we're about to start round 3, where you're going to increase into the front and back of every stitch, and this is where I think it's a good time to get on to 4 double pointed needles. I'm just going to pull my stitches excuse me, into the middle of the back DPN so they don't fall off. And I take my 3rd needle and I'm going to knit into the front and back of this first stitch. Now here's a good time to put a stitch marker on as well, so you remember which is the first needle. We're about to go on to 4 needles, and you might forget which one is the first needle. Here I'm increasing into the front and back of the second stitch. So I got 4 stitches on my first needle. Pick up another double pointed needle. Leave those other 2 needles dangling in the back. Don't even think about them. And knit into the front and back of the next 2 stitches. Okay, I turn my work so that I've got my last needle facing me. Drop the other 2. If you're worried about those stitches falling off, just put them into the center of your double pointed needle and carry on knitting into the front and to the back of each stitch. And gradually we get ourselves onto 4 double pointed needles. That's my last one. There we go. When you're increasing, the stitches are very tight, and so you may have to push the stitch that you're knitting onto the tapered end of the needle in order to get your other needle tip into it. There. All right, so you can see that I have 4 stitches on each of my double pointed needles, and there's the very, very small top of my hat. The next round instruction is to just knit, so I'll go ahead and do that. Again, it's just, you just keep moving in the round. Here's the last stitch that I knit, and in order to be able to knit a nice circle, I want to use it in the next stitch to the left of it. So that's what I'm going to do. This part feels like you have a lot of needles in play, but as you get more stitches on, those needles, they just spread out quite nicely. All right, we're about to begin round 5, and the instructions here are to increase and to put stitch markers into place. So you knit the first stitch, knit into the front and back of the next stitch, place a marker. Well, my marker is already there, so I'm just going to move it over. Then knit 1 and knit into the front and back of the next stitch. There we go. And then I turn my work, knit 1, knit into the front and back of the next stitch, place a marker, knit 1, knit into the front and back of the next stitch, turn my work, knit 1, knit into the front and back of the next stitch, place a marker. You can use any kind of markers you want, but I do like to use a different marker for the first of the round marker. So on my first needle, the marker that I'm using is different than the markers on the rest of the needle, and that helps me to remember that this is the first round. All right, this is the hardest part of the hat. There's the inside. Here's the outside with my I-cord coming up from it. And you'll see I have 3 different markers and 1 special marker to mark the beginning of the round. The next round is just to knit, and then you increase, and then you knit, and then you increase, and you keep doing that until the circumference of the hat is big enough for the head that you want to fit it on. To measure the circumference, you're basically measuring the distance around the 4 needles. At the beginning here, it's very difficult to do that, but as you get bigger and bigger, you can just measure the distance across here and multiply that by 4 to get your head circumference. If you want the hat to fit snugly, make the circumference of your hat slightly smaller than the size of the head that you're making it for, 1/2 inch or 1 inch. If you want it to fit slouchy, by all means knit it as big and wide as you want, and then decrease a little bit before you start the brim.